Maya had always been excited about the first day of school. She had her new backpack on, her shoes shining, and her mind filled with hopes of a fresh start. Maya was a smart, enthusiastic girl who loved learning, and this year she was ready to tackle whatever came her way. However, little did she know, this year would not be the same as her previous ones. When she walked into her new classroom, the first thing that caught her eye was her teacher. Miss Clark was a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, and there was something in the way she glanced at Maya that didn't feel quite right. Maya shrugged it off, trying to focus on finding a seat. As she walked through the rows of desks, she couldn't help but notice how the other students stared at her. Maya was used to this. Being one of the few black students in the school, she often felt like she stood out, but she had learned to ignore it. She was proud of who she was, and nothing was going to stop her from shining in class. The bell rang, and Miss Clark stood at the front, ready to begin. The teacher's voice was sharp and commanding, yet Maya couldn't shake off the feeling that Miss Clark's eyes were always on her. When it was time to introduce themselves, Maya spoke confidently. She shared her love for reading and science, hoping that her words would paint a picture of who she truly was. But when she finished, Miss Clark barely acknowledged her. In fact, it was as if Maya's answer hadn't mattered at all. Miss Clark quickly moved on to the next student without a second glance at her. Maya felt the sting of being ignored, but she brushed it off. Maybe Miss Clark was just tired, she thought. She tried to focus on the lesson, eager to prove herself. But things didn't get any better as the day went on. Every time she raised her hand, Miss Clark seemed to overlook her, letting the other students answer. When Maya finally did get called on, her answer was quickly dismissed, and the teacher moved on, as if it was nothing important. This was the first time Maya had felt truly unseen in a classroom, and it bothered her more than she cared to admit. She was used to being recognized for her achievements, but now, in Miss Clark's class, it felt like none of it mattered. Maya tried to remain calm, telling herself that maybe she was just overthinking things. Perhaps the teacher was busy, or maybe it was just the first day, and everything would settle down soon. However, the way Ms. Clark treated her wasn't something Maya could easily forget. She noticed the subtle things, like how Ms. Clark always seemed to pick on her answers, questioning them in a way that felt different than how she questioned the other students. Maya wasn't sure why, but it felt like she was being singled out for something she couldn't control. And as the day went on, it became more and more clear to her that something wasn't right. When the bell rang at the end of the school day, Maya left the classroom feeling a bit uneasy. She knew she had done nothing wrong, yet something about Miss Clark's behavior made her feel like she didn't belong there. She hoped that it was just a rough first day, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that this year might be harder than she thought. As the days passed, Maya began to notice more subtle but unsettling things about her teacher, Miss Clark. At first, she tried to ignore it, convincing herself that maybe it was just a misunderstanding. However, as time went on, it became clear that Miss Clark had a pattern. Every time Maya answered a question in class, her responses were treated differently from the other students. When Maya raised her hand, Miss Clark would glance at her with a sharp, cold look before quickly moving on to someone else. It wasn't that Maya didn't have the right answers. It was more about how Miss Clark made her feel as if her input didn't matter at all. On the few occasions when Maya was called on, her answers were dismissed with a wave of the hand or a simple, "That's not quite right." The tone in Miss Clark's voice wasn't gentle or constructive. It was as though Maya's ideas were not even worth a deeper explanation. Other students were praised for their efforts, even when their answers weren't entirely correct, but Maya's contributions were quickly overlooked. It was a confusing and painful feeling for Maya. She began to wonder why this was happening. Was it because of her accent? Was it because of the color of her skin? These thoughts made her uncomfortable, but she tried her best to push them aside. One afternoon, Maya worked hard on a group project, making sure every detail was perfect. She had done the research, gathered all the necessary information, and contributed equally to the work. But when Miss Clark reviewed the project, she seemed to ignore Maya's role completely. Instead, she complimented the other students, giving them credit for things that Maya knew she had worked on. Maya's classmates noticed the unfair treatment, but they didn't know how to speak up. They were also unsure whether this was something they should get involved in. So, they remained silent, leaving Maya to face it alone. The next day, during a class discussion, Maya answered a question about a historical event. She was confident in her response, and her classmates seemed to agree with her. But when Miss Clark responded, her eyes narrowed, and she repeated the question in a way that made Maya feel like her answer was completely wrong. "Are you sure about that, Maya?" she asked in a condescending tone. "Perhaps you didn't understand it the way I intended." Maya felt a wave of embarrassment rush over her, and her heart sank. Her classmates looked uncomfortable, and the room seemed to go quiet. Maya couldn't help but feel like Ms. Clark was singling her out, even though she had worked hard and had the correct information. It didn't make sense to her. Why was she being treated this way? She tried not to let it affect her, but it was becoming harder and harder. Each day, Maya sat in that classroom, hoping things would get better, but they didn't. Instead, the bullying seemed to grow. Miss Clark's remarks were becoming sharper, and her treatment of Maya was growing colder. At home, Maya confided in her parents about the way Miss Clark was treating her. She didn't want to complain, but it was getting to the point where it was hard to stay silent. Her parents listened carefully, offering words of encouragement. "You're stronger than you think, Maya," her mother said. "Just keep doing your best." Maya nodded, but she couldn't shake the feeling that things weren't going to change unless someone stood up to the unfairness. As the weeks passed, Maya began to feel more isolated in class. The teasing comments from Miss Clark continued, and it started to take a toll on her confidence. It wasn't just the small remarks anymore. It was the way she was treated as if she didn't belong. She would raise her hand to answer a question, only for the teacher to ignore her and call on someone else. If Maya ever managed to get an answer out, it was met with a dismissive, "That's not exactly what I meant," or "Maybe next time. Try again." No matter how hard she tried, Miss Clark's response felt like a constant reminder that her presence in the class didn't matter. Maya found herself dreading the thought of going to school each day. She had always been excited about learning, but now the classroom felt like a place where she wasn't welcome. Her friends started to notice her quiet demeanor, but Maya didn't want to burden them with her problems. She didn't want to make a big deal out of it. Still, it was hard not to notice the looks her friends exchanged when Miss Clark made a cruel remark, or when they saw how Maya's answers were treated with such disregard. They were uncomfortable, but they didn't know what to do about it. The more Miss Clark bullied her, the more Maya started to doubt herself. She began to second-guess every answer she gave in class, afraid that it would be dismissed just like the last one. The girl who once loved answering questions and participating in class was now shrinking into the background. Even when she knew the correct answer, she hesitated. She felt as if everything she said was wrong in the teacher's eyes. One day, during a history lesson, Miss Clark asked a question about a historical figure. Maya's hand shot up, and her heart raced as she felt the familiar weight of Miss Clark's gaze. When the teacher finally called on her, Maya spoke confidently about what she knew. But before she could even finish her sentence, Miss Clark interrupted her. "Maya, that's not exactly how it happened," she said with a raised eyebrow. "Maybe you should pay more attention in class." Maya's face burned with embarrassment, and she quickly looked down at her desk, trying to hide her discomfort. She was frustrated. She had studied for this lesson and knew the material inside and out, but once again, Miss Clark made her feel small and insignificant. The worst part was that no one seemed to be willing to speak up. Maya's classmates, who had once been friendly, had started to distance themselves from her. She could sense their awkwardness whenever Miss Clark said something cruel or unfair. They would glance at her with sympathy, but no one was brave enough to say anything. It made Maya feel even more alone, as though she was fighting this battle by herself. As the days turned into weeks, Maya's frustration grew. She tried to talk to her friends, hoping they would understand. But every time she did, they seemed too scared to say anything to the teacher. The feeling of being invisible, of being ignored, became unbearable. Maya wasn't sure how much longer she could take it, but she knew that something had to change. She couldn't keep going to school every day, feeling like a target in the classroom. One afternoon, Maya decided she couldn't stay silent any longer. She had to stand up for herself. But how could she confront her teacher when no one else was speaking out? How could she make things right when it felt like everyone was too afraid to do anything? Maya didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't let Miss Clark's treatment define who she was. It was time to take control of the situation, even if it meant standing alone. Maya sat in class, feeling the mix of frustration and determination. She had always been a quiet person, someone who preferred to handle things on her own. But as the days dragged on, the unfair treatment from Miss Clark became harder and harder to ignore. She knew she couldn't just keep letting it happen. Yet she wasn't sure what to do next. It wasn't easy to speak up against a teacher, especially when no one else seemed to be willing to. For the longest time, Maya didn't tell anyone about her family's connection to the school. Her father, the principal, was someone important in the school system, but Maya didn't want to use that connection for special treatment. She had always believed that the best way to succeed was through hard work and perseverance. She didn't want people to think that her achievements were tied to who her father was, not to her own abilities. But as the bullying grew worse, Maya started to reconsider her decision to keep her family's identity a secret. It was clear that Miss Clark was not going to stop targeting her. Maya knew that if she told her teacher who her father was, things might change. However, she didn't want to use her father's position to get out of a tough situation. She didn't want to be seen as someone who was only privileged because of her last name. Maya had always wanted to prove herself on her own terms, without any outside help. Still, as much as Maya tried to stay strong, the weight of the situation was starting to wear her down. She began to dread going to school every day. The thought of facing Ms. Clark's cold stares and dismissive comments filled her with anxiety. She could feel the tension building inside her, but she didn't know how to release it. Every time she entered that classroom, she braced herself for another round of unfair treatment, another snide remark, or another moment where her hard work was ignored. One day, after another round of condescending remarks from Miss Clark, Maya felt her frustration bubble up to the surface. She had been holding everything in for so long, and it finally felt like enough was enough. In a moment of quiet resolve, she made a decision. It was time to let Ms. Clark know who she really was. After class, when the room had emptied out, Maya walked up to her teacher's desk. She felt nervous, but there was also a sense of calm determination. She wasn't sure what she expected to happen, but she knew that it was time for the truth to come out. With her heart pounding in her chest, Maya looked at Ms. Clark and said, "I need to tell you something. My dad is the principal of this school. He's been the principal for a long time." The words felt strange coming out of her mouth, but she stood tall, trying to keep her voice steady. Ms. Clark raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised. "Is that so?" she replied, a little too casually. "Well, that's interesting." Maya's throat felt tight, but she didn't back down. "I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want anyone to think I was trying to use my father's position for favors. But I can't keep letting you treat me this way. It's not right." There was a long pause before Miss Clark said anything. For the first time, she didn't seem sure of herself. She shifted in her seat and cleared her throat. "I didn't realize," she began, but the words seemed to trail off. Maya didn't wait for her teacher to finish. "It's not just about me. It's about everyone who has to sit in this classroom and deal with the way you treat them. I may be the one speaking up right now, but there are others who feel the same way." The tension in the room was thick, and Maya could tell that Miss Clark didn't know how to respond. It was a strange feeling, knowing that she had said something so important, even if the teacher wasn't ready to admit it. Maya felt a mixture of pride and uncertainty. She had stood up for herself, but she wasn't sure what would happen next. As Maya walked out of the classroom, she didn't feel relief. Instead, she felt like she had just opened a door to something bigger. She didn't know what would happen after this conversation, but she knew that she had done what she could to change the situation. Whether it was enough or not, she had taken the first step in confronting the unfairness, and that was something to be proud of. The next day, Maya walked into the classroom feeling a mix of emotions. Part of her was relieved that she had finally spoken up to Miss Clark. She had done something that felt important, something that gave her a sense of control. But the other part of her was nervous. She didn't know what the consequences of her words would be. Would Miss Clark treat her even worse now? Would she make things more difficult for her? As she sat down at her desk, Maya noticed that Miss Clark was acting a little differently. The teacher's usual sharp gaze seemed softened, though it was hard to tell if it was just an act or if something had truly changed. When Miss Clark began the lesson, she didn't make any cutting remarks toward Maya. For the first time in weeks, Maya wasn't immediately dismissed when she raised her hand. It felt strange but also a little hopeful. Still, Maya kept her guard up. She wasn't sure if the sudden shift in behavior meant that Miss Clark had really listened or if it was just a temporary attempt to avoid conflict. As the lesson went on, Maya found herself participating more freely. Her answers were taken seriously for once, and she even saw a slight nod of approval from the teacher. But Maya couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something off. She had been ignored for so long that it was hard to believe everything was suddenly fine. When the bell rang for lunch, Maya hesitated before leaving the classroom. Her friends were already waiting for her outside, but she wasn't sure if she should talk to them about what had happened. They had all seen how Miss Clark had treated her, and Maya didn't want to make it seem like she was expecting them to fight her battles for her. She had handled it herself, but now that she was faced with their questioning looks, she wasn't sure how to explain it. Maya joined her friends at the lunch table, trying to keep her thoughts focused on something else. But it was clear they were curious. "Hey, Maya, you okay?" One of her friends, Jenna, asked. "You seemed like you had a tough time in there yesterday." Maya smiled weakly, nodding. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, not wanting to go into the details. "Just had to clear the air with Miss Clark." Jenna raised an eyebrow. "You did? What happened?" Maya hesitated for a moment, unsure if she should talk about it, but then she realized that her friends had seen the way Miss Clark had been treating her. They'd watched it happen every day, and they deserved to know how it had been addressed. "I just told her who my dad is," Maya explained quietly. "I didn't want to, but I felt like she needed to know. She's been treating me like I don't belong in the class, and I had to say something." The table fell silent for a moment. Then Jenna spoke up. "Wow, that's bold," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "I don't think I would have the guts to do that." Maya shrugged. "I wasn't sure if it was the right thing to do, but it felt like I had no choice anymore. I couldn't just keep letting her push me down." Her friends nodded in agreement. Maya could tell that they understood, even if they hadn't been in the same situation. They had seen her struggle, and now they saw how she was trying to take control of it. Maya felt a small sense of pride, but also uncertainty. Would Miss Clark really change, or was this just a temporary truce? When the next class rolled around, Maya noticed that Miss Clark's attitude had shifted once again. It was as though the confrontation had left a mark on her. While she still wasn't as warm as some of the other teachers, her tone had softened. There were no more sarcastic remarks, no more ignoring Maya's contributions. It was as if the teacher was trying, at least for now, to make amends. Maya couldn't quite believe it. Part of her was hopeful that things might get better, but another part of her felt cautious. She wasn't going to let herself relax just yet. She had made it clear that she deserved respect, but she knew that one change in behavior didn't mean everything had been fixed. Still, for the first time in weeks, Maya felt like she could breathe a little easier. She was being seen again, and that, in itself, was a victory. The next few days were filled with a strange mix of relief and tension. Maya felt like something had shifted in her relationship with Miss Clark, but she wasn't entirely sure if it was genuine change or just a temporary adjustment. She couldn't ignore the fact that Miss Clark had treated her better after their conversation, but the teacher's behavior still felt distant, almost mechanical. It was as if she was walking on eggshells around Maya, careful not to upset her again. Maya wasn't sure if she should be grateful for the improvement or if she should remain cautious. She had spent weeks enduring subtle jabs and dismissals, and while the change in Miss Clark's treatment was a welcome relief, it felt like the teacher was simply doing the bare minimum. Maya couldn't help but wonder if it was because of her father's position as principal that Miss Clark had backed off. She wasn't sure if the apology, or whatever this behavior was heartfelt, or if Miss Clark was simply trying to avoid consequences. Still, Maya tried to stay focused on her studies. The classroom wasn't perfect, but it was better than it had been. She participated more freely now, and when she gave an answer, it was met with acknowledgement, not dismissal. Miss Clark even asked her opinion on a few assignments, which Maya took as a small victory. But there were still moments when Maya caught the teacher watching her with a kind of guarded curiosity. It was hard to know if things were truly improving or if Miss Clark was just trying to avoid any more confrontation. At home, Maya had a long conversation with her parents about what had been happening at school. Her father, who was the principal, had noticed a change in her demeanor over the past few weeks. He asked if everything was okay, and Maya, for the first time, opened up about what had been going on. She told him about the constant dismissals, the comments from Miss Clark, and how she had finally confronted her teacher about her father's position. Her parents listened carefully, offering their support without judgment. They didn't want to rush into anything too drastic, but they also wanted to ensure that Maya felt heard. Her father was particularly concerned. "You shouldn't have to deal with that," he said, his voice full of concern. "You're my daughter, and no one should treat you that way, especially in school." Maya's mother, always calm and wise, reminded her that it was important to speak up for herself, but also to be patient. "It's not easy to make people change," her mother said gently, "but you've done the right thing by standing up for yourself." Maya appreciated their support, but she still felt conflicted. Her father's position at the school gave her an advantage, but she didn't want anyone to think she was using that as a way to get special treatment. She didn't want to be seen as someone who couldn't handle things on her own. But at the same time, she knew that things weren't right in her classroom. She wasn't just dealing with a difficult teacher. She was facing a teacher who had made it clear she didn't believe Maya deserved to be there. In the days that followed, Maya noticed small changes in Miss Clark's behavior. While it was still awkward at times, the teacher seemed to be trying harder to engage with her. She made a point to call on Maya more often, even when it wasn't necessary. Maya didn't know if this was an attempt at making amends or if it was just a way to avoid any further tension. What she did know was that it felt different, but she wasn't sure if it was enough. One afternoon, after a particularly engaging lesson where Maya had felt truly included, Miss Clark stayed behind as the students filed out of the room. Maya hesitated for a moment before gathering the courage to stay behind as well. She wasn't sure if it was the right time to bring up their conversation again, but she had an uneasy feeling that there was more to be said. When the last student had left, Miss Clark turned to her. "I just wanted to say, I know things have been difficult between us," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I realize I may have been too hard on you, and I'm sorry if I made you feel like you didn't belong." Maya was taken aback. It wasn't exactly an apology she had expected, but it was still an apology. Miss Clark's words weren't full of warmth, but there was a sincerity in them that Maya couldn't ignore. "Thank you," Maya replied, unsure of what else to say. She had expected more defensiveness, more excuses, but there was none. It felt like a small step toward repairing something that had been broken for too long. As Maya walked out of the classroom that day, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders. Things weren't perfect, and she wasn't sure if they ever would be, but for the first time in weeks, she felt like she had taken control of the situation. She had spoken up for herself, and that hadn't. After that conversation with Miss Clark, things felt different for Maya. She wasn't sure if the apology was enough, but at least there had been an attempt to make things right. For the next few days, she cautiously returned to class, her eyes open for any sign that the teacher might revert to her old ways. Each day, Maya noticed that the treatment was slightly better, but it still didn't feel completely sincere. She couldn't shake the feeling that Miss Clark was trying to avoid trouble rather than truly changing her behavior. Maya continued to work hard, focusing on her assignments and trying to keep a positive attitude. She found comfort in the support of her friends, who noticed the small shifts in her classroom dynamic. They told her they were proud of her for standing up for herself, and that meant a lot. Still, Maya couldn't help but wonder if anyone else in the class had noticed how Miss Clark had treated her in the past. She started to feel like an outsider in her own classroom, even though things were technically better. The classroom was no longer a place of open hostility, but the walls of unspoken tension still seemed to hang in the air. One afternoon, Maya sat at her desk during study time, quietly working through her math problems. She couldn't help but overhear some of the other students whispering nearby. At first, she thought they were talking about something unrelated, but then a few words caught her attention. "I don't know why Miss Clark always picks on her," one student said, their voice low. "I mean, Maya's always doing well in class. Why is she always getting treated like that?" Maya's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. It was as though the other students finally realized what had been happening all along. The sense of relief was overwhelming. For weeks, Maya had felt like she was the only one who saw the unfairness, and to hear her classmates speak up, even in whispers, made her feel less alone. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sudden sound of the classroom door opening. Miss Clark walked in, and the room fell silent. Maya glanced around the room, noticing how the atmosphere had shifted. For the first time, there was a sense of unity among the students, and Maya could see that they no longer saw her as someone who needed to be ignored or dismissed. They understood, whether they had spoken up or not. The rest of the lesson proceeded without incident. Miss Clark was still not the warmest teacher, but she was no longer overtly cold. She seemed to be putting in more effort to acknowledge all her students equally, and Maya couldn't deny that she felt a small sense of progress. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than before. As the days went by, Maya noticed more changes in the way Miss Clark interacted with the class. It was subtle, but she could tell that the teacher was trying to avoid any further issues. There were still moments when Miss Clark would give her a questioning look, but they were fewer. Maya felt like she was finally being seen, not just for who she was, but for the hard work she put in each day. Despite the improvement in Miss Clark's behavior, Maya couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. She had stood up for herself, but more than that, she had taken a stand for what was right. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about everyone in that classroom who might have been silently enduring the same treatment. Maya realized that speaking up wasn't just a way to fix things for herself, but also a way to set an example for others. One evening, while talking with her parents, Maya mentioned the changes she had seen in Miss Clark's attitude. Her father listened carefully, nodding in approval. "I'm proud of you, Maya," he said. "It takes courage to stand up for yourself, and I can see that it made a difference." Maya smiled, but she knew that her journey wasn't over. The road to change was long, and she still had a lot to prove, not just to her teacher, but to herself. She had shown resilience in the face of adversity, and that was something she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Even though the situation wasn't perfect, Maya had learned something important. Change takes time, but the first step is always the hardest, and once you take it, it sets the stage for everything that follows. She knew she had made a difference, and that was something she could be proud of, no matter what happened next. As the weeks went by, Maya's sense of uncertainty slowly began to fade. Things in the classroom had improved, and while Miss Clark was still not the friendliest teacher, there was a noticeable change in how she treated Maya. The dismissive remarks were less frequent, and Maya found herself participating in class without that constant knot of anxiety in her stomach. There were still moments of awkwardness, but they were fewer, and the classroom no longer felt like a battleground. Maya started to feel more confident. She focused on her schoolwork, determined to prove that she was capable of succeeding on her own. She noticed that her classmates, who had once been unsure of how to help her, were beginning to see her for who she really was. They no longer looked at her with pity or discomfort. Instead, they respected her for her intelligence and resilience. Maya had earned their respect, not because of who her father was, but because of her own strength. One afternoon, after a particularly successful class presentation, Maya received unexpected praise from Miss Clark. "Good job, Maya," she said, her tone surprisingly warm. That was a well-thought-out presentation. Maya's heart swelled with pride. It wasn't the loud, over-the-top praise she had sometimes wished for, but it was genuine. Miss Clark had acknowledged her hard work, and for Maya, that was enough. It felt like a small victory, one that showed her that the teacher was finally seeing her for who she was, not for her background or appearance. Even with the changes, Maya was aware that not everything was perfect. There were still moments when Miss Clark's old habits resurfaced, but Maya was no longer afraid to speak up if something felt off. She had found her voice, and she wasn't going to let anyone silence it again. The experience had taught her that standing up for herself wasn't just about addressing the immediate issue. It was about making sure her boundaries were respected in the long run. Maya's relationship with her friends also grew stronger during this time. They saw the way she handled the situation with dignity, and they were inspired by her courage. They often told her how proud they were of her, and Maya could see the change in how they interacted with her as well. It was as though the walls of unspoken tension that had once existed between her and her classmates had finally crumbled. They were no longer uncomfortable or unsure of how to be around her. Instead, they valued her as a friend and a peer. Her parents were proud of her too, but more than anything, they were glad to see that Maya had found her strength. Her father, the principal, had heard about the changes from some of the other teachers, and he quietly acknowledged that Maya had handled the situation with maturity. He knew that as a parent, he could only do so much. The rest was up to Maya, and she had proven that she was more than capable of handling it herself. One day, towards the end of the school year, Maya found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. She thought back to those early days when she felt small and invisible in the classroom, and to the moment when she had finally stood up to Miss Clark. The whole experience had changed her. It had taught her that she was worthy of respect, no matter what others might think or say. And it had shown her the power of using her voice to stand up for what was right. As she walked out of school for the last time that year, Maya felt a sense of accomplishment that went beyond grades or awards. She had faced a challenge head-on, and she had come out stronger on the other side. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Maya knew that the lessons she had learned in that classroom about courage, resilience, and standing up for herself would stay with her for the rest of her life. As the summer stretched ahead, Maya felt excited for the future. She knew that no matter what came next, she had the strength to face it. She had learned to trust herself, to speak up, and to never settle for anything less than the respect she deserved. And that, Maya realized, was the greatest victory of all.